Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When those around him saw what was going to happen, they said to him, Lord, shall we strike with a sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, Permit even this. And he touched his ear and healed him.
Good morning. If you will forgive the way my voice sounds this morning, and it will probably go as I speak even further. So I apologize if my voice is a bit rough for you this morning. Trying to get over something here. As we start here this morning, I just want to thank our visitors for being here. You are our honored guests. If you have any questions about anything that you have seen or heard this morning, please feel free to ask me or our elders or any of our members, and we'll help you in whatever way you need. And you've chosen a good thing to be here this morning, to be worshiping God. And we're going to be learning this morning about cutting off ears. Is there ever a verse in the Bible where you just look at it and you say, what were they thinking? And this might be one of them for you. We're going to look at the primary passage that we're going to be looking at is Luke 22. So if you'll go ahead and turn there. Luke 22. And then the other passage that we're going to be focused on is John 18. So if you're at Luke 22 or John 18, those are kind of the two primary passages we're going to be looking at today. For those of you who are taking notes, our outline is going to be as follows. We're going to look at the context of the passages here, Luke 22. This event is actually found in all four Gospels. It's one of the few events that are found in all four. And then we're going to look at Peter's side of what happens. That's why I say John 18. John 18 is the only one who identifies both Peter and Malchus here in this story. But we're going to look at lessons that we learned from Peter's actions, then lessons we learned from Jesus' actions, and then we'll have some application for us at the end here. So that's the basic outline if you're taking notes. So let's look at the context here. These are all the verses that we find this event take place. I went ahead, you'll notice with Mark, I added verses 51 and 52. I'll note that here in just a moment. But I think you could stop at verse 50 with Mark 14, but I included 51 and 52, and I'll explain in a moment. And then Luke 22, verses 47 through 53, and John 18, verses 1 through 11. So let's start here in Luke 22. While he was still speaking, behold, a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was preceding him, and he approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When those who were around him saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, Stop, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come against him, Have you come out with swords and clubs as you would against a robber? While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this hour and the power of darkness are yours. If you turn over to, keep a finger here, turn over to John 18. we're starting verse 8. I told you I am he. If you so seek me, let these go their way. To fulfill the word which he spoke, of those whom you have given me, I lost no one. Simon Peter then, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear, and the slave's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? So we sort of have a full picture now, really. There is some uniqueness to each passage. In Matthew differs from the other three in that Jesus points out that I could call 12 legions of angels to protect me. I have means of protection if I wanted it. But he's not exercising that protection. I said here, Mark 14, the only way that we get any sort of uniqueness is that there's a disciple that's specifically mentioned in verses 51 and 52. And the only reason I bothered to add him is one, many scholars have hypothesized that this is in fact Mark, this man with the linen sheet. We don't know for certain if it is, but I just wanted to point out here that they do, looking at verses 51 and 52, they do try to seize the disciples. They just all manage to leave. And so if this is Mark or whoever this man is, he clearly is able to escape. But they do try to seize the disciples, it seems. What's unique about Luke is, first, is this request to strike. Verse 49, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And then what's also unique about Luke is we actually see then Jesus in verse 51 heals Malchus. And then in John, what's unique there is that we're actually named Peter and Malchus. If we look at some of the cultural significance of what's happening here, first, let's look at this idea of the slave of the high priest. And this is going to be important later as we move into the main part of the lesson. The word here is doulos, and doulos is a word that literally means slave. When we see that word in most other passages in the New Testament, it means a slave. For instance, when we're referring to Onesimus in Philemon, we use the word doulos. So it does literally mean a slave. However, one particular biblical scholar that others cite, his name is Benedict Viviano, and he points out that while doulos does literally mean slave, this word is also a word that shows deference to a royal or religious officer, someone who is a slave to the king, or in this context, the high priest. We saw it earlier in Luke 22, in verse 4, we use the same word. They went away and discussed with the chief priests and the officers, that's the plural of doulos there, how he might betray him to them. And then we see it here and also over in Acts chapters 4 and 5. We see the same word there as this doulos. But this idea of the slave of the high priest is actually not so much one of an actual literal slave, one that the high priest would have bought and considered property. No, the slave of the high priest is actually a position of the high priest's right hand. And anything that you did to the high priest's slave was considered as doing it to the high priest himself. So if you struck the slave of the high priest, then you, in essence, struck the high priest himself. And so now what we see is Peter has cut off the ear of the high priest, essentially, obviously not literally. And what that really would mean culturally. In fact, when you look at this idea of cutting off the high priest's ear, back in Leviticus chapter 21, Verses 16 through 23, it talks about how the high priest is to serve. And one of the things that's mentioned there is that the high priest cannot have a blemish. And in the Septuagint, it actually specifically translates that passage there. It says that he cannot have his ears cut. That's one of the ideas there. So if his ears are cut, then, as was the belief common throughout really the entirety of the Jewish nation, especially up to Jesus' time, is that if the ear was cut, that you could not serve as high priest. You were with blemish. And in fact, we actually have accounts of this. One such account is of Antigonus and Hyrcanus. We're told this by Josephus. And we see that Antigonus is helping Hyrcanus, who was high priest at the time, was helping him with one of his ceremonial washings. So he helps him immerse, and then it says, when he came out of the water, he bit off part of his ear as a way of removing Hyrcanus' ability to be high priest. And that's exactly what we see in history. He steps down out of office because that's what he was called to do. You can't serve as high priest anymore. And the person Antigonus wanted to be high priest then became high priest in place of Hyrcanus. So this is not something entirely crazy. Now, if you took off the ear of the high priest's slave, I don't think the high priest would step down. But it is a moment of thought, seeing this happen and all the implication of all of this. And there's a third aspect to consider here. And most scholars will agree about this. Some scholars say that it's not as clear cut as one might think. But most scholars agree that the assault of the high priest, or even of the slave of the high priest, since you're assaulting the high priest himself, this is a capital offense. That by Peter reaching out and essentially attacking the high priest, Peter could be called into court and executed, according to Jewish law at the time. And so now we have to deal with this now. So instead of just arresting Jesus, now we have to deal with Peter as well. Okay, so I want you to keep all of these things in mind, okay, as we consider now lessons that we can take from Peter and Jesus. Okay? So let's look first at Peter. The first thing is to go back to Luke 22, since we know that ultimately the one who strikes is Peter. We don't know if he's the one who asks in verse 49, but just for the sake of the lesson this morning, we're just going to make the assumption that it is Peter. So first we see that Peter asks, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" When you go back and look earlier in the context as to why they even have these swords, it calls into question whether or not this was what Jesus intended by the disciples carrying swords. And I think that Jesus meant for their sword carrying to be one thing, and now the disciples are saying, "Oh, is this what you meant for us to have swords?" But notice here that Jesus doesn't make any response to the question. All we see then is verse 50, one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. I am one that holds that this is accidental. I don't think a fisherman would be this proficient with a sword. I could be wrong. But I highly doubt that he was so proficient as to neatly slice off the ear of Malchus. It's probably just a lashing out. He's just trying to kill whoever is right in front of the crowd, trying to arrest Jesus. And actually, I believe it's Matthew's account that it says, when they seize Jesus. That's when the disciple, Peter, attacks. And so it could be that Malchus is one of the people coming to grab Jesus. He's acting in place of the high priest. And so he's coming to be part of the group that's arresting Jesus. So he's reaching out to take hold of Jesus to arrest him. And so Peter just swings. But he ends up cutting off his ear. But notice that he doesn't wait for Jesus to answer. And honestly, this was the right thing to do at first. Verse 49, is this what you wanted? I think based on Jesus' teaching over the last 3 or so years, the answer should be relatively obvious. But I can understand tensions are high, emotions are flaring. Oh, is this what you just said? We should make sure we have swords. Is this what you wanted? But they don't wait for Jesus' answer. And so, of course, when he lashes out, this was not the appropriate response of having a sword. This is not what Jesus was intending when he asked them to carry swords. Because Jesus made it clear in his teaching that we are not called to violence or killing for Jesus or the Father. That is not who we are to be as Christians. In fact, Paul goes so far as to say the exact opposite. As much as depends on you, be at peace with all men. It is not for us to wield the sword of violence or killing for Christ, for the name of Christianity, as many have done in the past. And Jesus made this absolutely clear in his ministry. So then it is no surprise then that Jesus says, stop. No more of this in verse 51, and then goes a step further and heals him. It's interesting when you read the other 3 accounts, there's no record of Jesus healing. But here we do see it in Luke's account, that he heals Malchus. We also see from Peter's actions here that we should not fight against the clearly stated will of the Father. I've had debates with people in the past that were revolving around self-defense of the home. And someone said they used this passage to say we shouldn't fight against the will of the Father. And if it's the will of the Father that you die in a home invasion, you should let it happen. And I said, is that really what we see going on here? Is that the lesson that Jesus is trying to teach Peter here? And whatever you feel about that, I think that is perhaps missing the point of the lesson that Jesus is trying to teach Peter in this moment. I think the clearer lesson here is more so that Jesus has been stating that this would happen. Jesus has been teaching them that the prophets declared this would happen, that Moses declared it when he brought about substitutionary sacrifice. This has always been the plan for the Christ. This has always been the plan for the Messiah. Look at Psalm 22. Look at Isaiah 53. This is what God was expecting would happen to the Messiah. And not only has Jesus been telling them this is going to happen, he's also been telling them not to worry because after I'm killed, I will be raised. So why are we bothering to stop the very thing that needs to happen for the sins of the world? Now, yes, we do see Jesus reaches out, for instance, to Judas and gives him the opportunity to change his mind. All of the people here had their free will fully intact. However, this is what was always prophesied. This has always been the will of the Father, that the Son would sacrifice himself willingly on the cross. If the Son fought against his captors, this would not be a willing sacrifice. Isaiah 53, there Isaiah says, as the sheep before its shears is silent. And I think that's more than just answering the trial that we're going to get into later in the book of Luke. This is also about not fighting against what is the clearly stated will of the Father, which is different than if I don't know what the will of the Father is in a particular moment. And is fighting against the will of the Father going to change the will of the Father? No, what we're seeing here is Jesus knows, after he's just prayed, that this cup pass, and God, in his absence of answer, says no. God has already declared what his will of the matter is. And of course, this isn't just about the will in any given moment, but what is his will for your life? What's his will for your knowledge? The plan of salvation, for your study of his word, your prayer. What is his will for you? Is it the time for you to argue as you look at what he's clearly laid out for you in his word? It's no more a time for you to fight against his clearly stated word in his Bible than it was for Peter to lash out at his arresters. And now, again, to go along with that, Peter didn't wait for an answer from Jesus. At least not one that's shown, but at worst, Jesus did say no, and Peter did it anyway. Either way, this is a horrible thing that Peter has done. It is not up for us to act of our own will. There are certain things in our life that, yes, are simple decisions that don't require the will of the Father. What am I going to eat this morning for breakfast? But the way that we act in our daily life that is laid out in Scripture, what does Jesus want? What is Jesus' answer for the thing that you do next? Should I talk to the person in the aisle of the grocery store with me? What about the person who's come to fix my home? Should I speak with them about their Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and whether or not they know him? What is Jesus' will for that moment? How about when I'm driving to work? What's Jesus' will for me when I'm driving? Did Jesus say anything that has any bearing on my driving habits? All of these things, we must wait for an answer from Jesus. And so often we don't. We don't wait for Jesus' answer. Or again, as we stated was also a possibility, Jesus said no and we do it anyway. Because, well, all Jesus wants is for us to love each other. All Jesus wanted was compassion. All Jesus wanted was for all to come to him, and so that's what I'm doing, right? I'm just making it so that all people can come to him. Is that what Jesus really wanted? No, wait for an answer from Jesus. But I want to focus more this morning. At first, as I was writing this lesson, I really wanted to just focus on Jesus and the 3 lessons we learned from Jesus. But I felt like there was a good contrast in Peter as I was preparing the lesson. And I felt like it was important for us to talk about Peter first before we focus on Jesus. There's 4 lessons here. At first I had 3, but as I worked more on it, there's 4. 4 lessons that we learn from Jesus here with Malchus. The first is that Jesus taught us to be good to our enemies. It would seem that when you take all 4 accounts together, what's happening here is there are those who have reached over to seize Jesus, and that Peter, taking his sword, is lashing out at those who have taken hold of him. And so Malchus is one of those people that have taken hold of Jesus. He has clearly made his feelings about Jesus known by trying to arrest him. He is clearly an enemy of Jesus. He clearly thinks of Jesus as a blasphemer. And yet, Jesus does good for him. He heals him in the presence of all. This was not something that Malchus comes secretly and says, Jesus, I just don't know about this arrest. And Jesus says, well, here, let me show you how I feel about you, and heals his ear, and it's this great moment between the two of them. No. What we find is Jesus right then and there. I don't know if he picked up his ear and put it back on. I don't know if he just grew another one for him. I don't know. But it's right there in front of everyone. We all know what happened. We all know that his ear was cut off, or some would say his earlobe, either way. He has been maimed in some way. And Jesus has miraculously healed him despite the moment. It says here that we have an entire cohort that the Sanhedrin have called to help them, an entire Roman cohort. That's some 600 or so people. Let alone all of the Sanhedrin that have decided to show up tonight, the different servants they've sent, like Malchus. There are hundreds of people here that can witness what has happened. Witness what Peter did, but now witness what Jesus has done as well. And yet, we're going to still clap him in irons and lead him away. The other thing here is Jesus knew what was at stake and needed to fulfill Scripture. That was his perception of what was going on. No, Peter, God has already declared that this would happen, and we're not going to fight it. And so he doesn't call his 12 legions of angels, because God made his will clear. Yes, Jesus gives people the chance to use their own free will and make another choice, but he doesn't prevent anyone from acting the way that was prophesied. And we need to know what's at stake, because Jesus could have saved himself. I love how Jesus says, I could have called 12 legions of angels, as though he couldn't have single-handedly done it himself. That at no point in what will happen for the next 12 to 15 hours was completely outside of his own control. That he could have said enough was enough and ripped his hands and feet from the nails. That he could have prevented the scourge from touching his skin. Jesus could have done all of that, let alone the 12 legions, the 24,000 angels that could come. Can you imagine the decimation when just 2 could lay waste to an entire city? 1 came through the land of Egypt and slew all of the firstborn children in a single night. Imagine what 24,000 are going to do. But this fourth point is really the crux of the entire sermon this morning. Jesus removed the evidence of Peter's guilt. They could have arrested Peter that night. There were witnesses. They could have arrested Peter and said, he struck the high priest by proxy, and we're going to execute him alongside his Messiah. But what is there to say when Jesus has given Malchus his ear back? Yeah, but Malchus, you still have your ear. Yes, you were attacked, you were assaulted, but all has been restored to you. And surely you understand where I'm going with this. Let's look at some application, as I'll say it unequivocally here in a moment. What we learn between Jesus and Peter is there's no response in violence. That is not how we respond as Christians. we are to be good to our enemies. If you want to have a talk about self-defense, that's not what I'm referring to this morning. We can have a conversation about that at another point. But listen, responding in violence has never been Christ's answer. There was a time in which God allowed his people to operate in such a manner during the law of Moses. Whether it was the conquest of Canaan, whether it was the warring of the kings during the united and divided kingdoms, God allowed his people at one point. But now that we have come to Christ and the cross and the new kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, there is no room for violence, either in trying to convince others of the truth. There is no call of God to force anyone into service to him, which is what the point of violence in the name of Christ really would be. And this is doing something that God has never given us authority to do. There is one group that has been given the authority to wield the sword in the New Testament, and that is Romans chapter 13. That is our government. No one else has been given the right to wield violence in the name of God. And that's not even the context of Romans 13 either. The government doesn't rule with the sword in the name of God. It rules in the name of peace and justice for its citizens. But when it comes to me and the Lord, I do not respond in violence. Next, God gives us all the answers that we need about what to do when difficulties arise. When emotions are high. When I am so blinded by my emotion, I know that I have somewhere to go that can arrest my emotions, can tell me what it is that I must do. Jesus has given us the answer to the question of, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? But if you're not listening to the Lord, if you're not reading what he said and what he gave others the authority to say in his stead, if you're not listening to them, then you're not following the will of Christ. So whether you wait for the answer or you deny the answer that you're given, both puts you at odds with Christ. For those of you who are not Christians this morning, the reattaching of Malchus's ear is for you. It was for Malchus as much as it was for Peter. Because what you see is interesting about our sin is really our sin is us attacking who? It's attacking God. We're swinging the sword at God. We have said enough is enough. And God can call the full weight of the law upon us. And yet, Jesus came. Jesus reattached the ear. He took the brunt of the justice for himself. And instead of me being found guilty for my sin, Jesus said, I will take the punishment instead. Now, don't be confused. As far as things go here on earth, we often still have to deal with the consequences of our sin. And sometimes others have to deal with the consequences of our sin. But just because there are consequences that must be fulfilled does not mean that God will still hold us in judgment. An easy understanding of this, illustration of this is with David and God. Nathan, after David sins with Bathsheba and he and Nathan have this talk, David says, I've sinned against the Lord. And Nathan says, yes, the Lord has forgiven you. but the life of the child is still required. There were consequences, although he was still forgiven in the eyes of God. But when all is said and done, the consequences here are wiped clean on the day of judgment. What matters is who we are as we stand before the throne of God. And when I stand at the throne of God, I will have Jesus as my defense attorney. He will stand there and say, Father, I've already paid the price for his sin. And God will say, all right, then he will join the sheep at my right hand. But there are those, when God gives the account of the sin of their lives, they will not have Jesus standing next to them. He will say, where is the propitiation for your sins? And there won't be an answer. And the only thing left to be required of them is to join the goats on his left hand, those who will be thrown into the fires of hell to serve out God's justice. And you don't have to be one of them. There's this term, gospel, that's all throughout the New Testament. And it's even a similar word used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament in certain passages. But that word gospel in Greek, it just means the good news. And this is your good news. Your good news is you don't have to stare down the justice of God. It's a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God, as the writer of Hebrews says. But you don't have to be terrified of that. I'm not terrified of that, not because I shouldn't be, but because Jesus has paid the price for my sin. And he can pay for yours as well. He can reattach the ear, so to speak. And you can stay right by him. Now that he's paid your price, you can stay right by him in this life and the next. A life lived with God here, a life lived with Jesus here, will be a life lived in eternity with him as well. And that's what you're being offered. The song we're going to sing is I Surrender All, quite fitting for the call with which you're being called this morning. If you surrender all of yourself to him, he will pay the price of your sin. He's already done it, but it will be applied to you as well. And the ledger books will be balanced in favor of you. But if you don't answer his call this morning, there's nothing that I or anyone can do for you. Once you walk out the door, what happens next is between you and the Lord. If he gives you another opportunity, wonderful, blessings to you. But you're not guaranteed another opportunity. And so don't waste the time that you're given now. Let Jesus help you. Let him reattach the ear as we stand and as we sing.